Well, welcome back for our discussion of the royal consciousness. We concluded this in chapter 2 of Brueggemann's prophetic imagination. And just to summarize everything, I don't know if you felt as I did as we were reading this. I mean, there are so many parallels with what we are experiencing today with this idea of the royal consciousness. And uh, Brueggemann concludes this chapter by saying, this royal consciousness really does everything it can to eradicate passion. Because when you eradicate passion, you also eradicate imagination and enthusiasm for the new. And the new is something that challenges, or the imaginative, that which is imagined, is what challenges the status quo. The royal consciousness, as established by Solomon being the kind of exemplary figure of this, over against Moses, establishes itself as the way of maintaining a kind of numbness to the world. You know, affluence is on the rise. Uh, Marginalized people are oppressed, and God loses the kind of abrasiveness, as Brueggemann calls it, that comes with a God of freedom. Uh, I think that the most important point here to remember is the way that God is manipulated and co-opted by the status quo. In this case, God becomes a functionary or basically a guarantor of the uh, the maintenance of the royal consciousness, the way that people are assured that all is well in the kingdom. Um, so there is, I really like what Brueggemann had to say, and this just by way of review is that the language of the royal consciousness is what we might call the bureaucracy speak, right? It's management prose. There's kind of a management mentality. Think about technical writing, for example, or think about the way that uh, legal documents are written, so that there's no possibility for imagination. Everything has to be very clearly established, lest there's some wiggle room or some gray areas. That's the language of the royal consciousness. Everything is about stasis, keeping things the way they are. Uh, Whereas the prophetic imagination is going to be quite different than that. Um, and the idea of this annulment of the neighbor as well. People come to be objectified and serve the needs of the hierarchy. And we certainly see that in our present situation. So Brueggemann is going to make the transition to basically argue for the need for a prophetic imagination. But what does that look like? And this is where the transition is going to take place. He's going to tell us very clearly what it looks like. But I'm wondering if any of you have any thoughts about, you know, concluding this chapter. I know that I could not help but think time and time again of our current situation, our current government administration, and the way that it is trying to maintain and create its own reality that offers, well, they use a lot of imagination in their interpretation of the law, but when it works for them, they're fine with imagination, but they don't want any uh, type of deviation from what they establish at the norm as the norm. And we see this, of course, in the way that education is now being completely undermined, because that's a place where what? Imagination took place, right? That's a place where creativity, where critical thinking, where people were encouraged to think of things in new ways, right? Think about it this way, but also think about it this way, thinking about options. Uh, that is an entree into what Brueggemann calls a prophetic imagination. Just at its most rudimentary level. But the lack of that imagination, the prose of the status quo, is what I think our current administration and perhaps every government, regardless of party, tries to maintain. So I mentioned this statue on Wall Street last week, and I really get a kick out of this. But this was guerrilla theater, by the way, guerrilla art, you might say. The bull on Wall Street being confronted by this intrepid little girl standing up, standing in his way. So, any thoughts before we move on to chapter three?
Dan,
Yeah,
I'm thinking that uh, this administration, has flipped stasis, you know, on its head. I mean, talk about the fragile nature of the mythos that makes democracy work or fail. And
right.
we're right in the midst of it, and we'll see if there are, what I would call normal elections, a year from with us coming November.
Yeah.
But wow, uh, things have happened very, very, very fast to change virtually all the rules
Yeah.
of the legal system.
But creating a new stasis, right? The Project 2025 is
Exactly.
as the static royal consciousness, and this is the chaos that precedes establishing that, Um, if
We
you've
never
read
thought
that,
would be possible,
I'm sorry, Denny?
which we never thought would be possible. Institutional, yeah,
Yeah, takeover, right. But if you've read that document, it in every way tries to establish, a new mythos, as you call it, that, I mean, let's not mince words. I mean, it leans towards white supremacy in a lot of ways. And we see what's happening with ICE and the way did you hear about this? I need to verify this, but I heard that yesterday or the day before in Boston, as people were getting ready to take their oath to, become citizens of the United States, ICE raided the courthouse where it was taking place and took people away. If they asked them, where are you from originally? And if they were on this list of countries that are, the naughty list, so to speak, uh, they were taken away. So they did everything right, and this is what we've heard from so many people, and people, we don't mind people becoming, citizens if they just do it right. Well, that just puts the lie to to that attitude. So, I mean, but how disappointing and frustrating that must be. Frustrating, maddening. I mean, it takes years to become an American citizen. You pass all the tests, which, by the way, I don't think many Americans can pass. Uh, you know, um, and then, you take the oath, but just as you're ready to do that, you're snatched away. I mean, it's a cynicism, a madness or an angry attitude that we just see. Um, I remember someone saying back in 2016 when our current president got elected, and that is, it's going to become a much more um, a meaner place to live. And boy, is it ever. But this is the context that Brueggemann is talking about. You know, this is what we need to bring to the surface and give language to and give, creed or give or to bring to people's imagination themselves so that they can at least be inspired to respond in a new creative way. Any other thoughts? I really appreciate people talking, so makes it lot more fun. Well, thank you. We're now getting into chapter three. Try to get myself there. And I mentioned this last time, maybe, and because the first question that all Americans are going to ask is this, you know, this this alternative consciousness that really begins with Moses and this egalitarian community based in covenant, where everyone has those who have much do not have too much, those who have little do not have too little. The question that will be asked in the, most people's minds is, well, how are we going to do this? Is it viable? And Brueggemann makes the point very clearly. That's not the first question to ask. The first question to ask is it imaginable? Can we imagine it? Because remember, according to him, we're living in the midst of this numbness where even our creativity, our ability to dream, our ability to be inspired by new ideas has been, repressed. Um, so imagination must come before implementation. And I think that's where we left off last time. Um, so what then are the tools of the prophet? If we are going to be asked to, employ a kind of prophetic imagination, what are the tools that we need to employ? And of course, this is where Brueggemann is not going to come up with something, he's not going to pull something out of the air. He is a scholar of the Old Testament, but more specifically, he's a scholar of the prophets. And more specifically, he's a scholar of Jeremiah. And if you know about the prophet Jeremiah, you can see his influence, Jeremiah's influence, throughout this text. And by the way, I did record what I'm doing with our Sunday school classes. I'm recording these special sessions on each of the prophets that we Greg and I hope will be used in churches that don't have pastors or churches that don't have access to educational materials, and they are available now wherever our videos are available. I don't really know because I don't watch them. Unfortunately, I guess I probably should just to see how weird I look. But but I did one on Jeremiah and really enjoyed getting back into that book. But it is available. So if you'd like to refresh your mind and imagination on Jeremiah and how Brueggemann has been inspired by him, it's just about a half hour to 40-minute session with some questions afterwards. And hopefully people will use it in Sunday school classes. But Brueggemann makes the point that the prophets are poets. The words of the prophets are written on the subway walls and tenement halls. You know, I mean, it's really true. I mean, if you've read some of the graffiti that I mean, some of it is very prophetic and very poetic. I always love to watch trains going by when I'm at a train crossing because there's just really and sometimes incomprehensible, often incomprehensible graffiti on these trains. But this is where the words of the prophets are welling up from the bottom, right? From the margins of society. And they're not speaking the prose of the royal consciousness. They're not speaking, bureaucracy speak, but they're writing in poetry. And if Dwight Marsh were here, uh, which he has been, in the past, I know he would be bringing up the example of Emily Dickinson, as she says, tell the truth, but tell it slant, right? Don't tell the truth in the prose of bureaucracy speak, because that just becomes an attestation to fact, right? But truth is something that you see out of the corner of your eye, and you can only offer an intimation of it. And if this intimation is known to others, then others can see it through their perspective. Fact only has one perspective. Truth, on the other hand, though it is tethered in, metaphysical reality, it can be perceived in a variety of ways. And giving voice to this variety is what the prophet is called to do. And this is why metaphor is so important. Uh, we know about descriptors, right? We speak in similes like I was running like a guy with his hair on fire. That's a simile, but a metaphor is far more complex and really offers an opportunity for a variety of experiences of the metaphor itself. Very simple metaphors are things like, war is a chess game, or, man is a wolf, but metaphors that well up from a tradition uh, come to speak to a very, very deep place in a person's soul. Um, and this really hits me where I live because the person I studied with at Vanderbilt, a woman by the name of Sally McFague, wrote a book about the time that I was going to graduate school called Metaphorical Theology, basically trying to get away from the way that systematic theology, using the language of bureaucracy and the prose of the royal consciousness, you might say, um, really missed a lot of the imagination that goes into theology. So thinking about metaphor when we express theological themes, and also undermining some of the oppressive ways that the prose of our tradition has kept us from understanding the dynamics of a concept in question. For example, uh, we've this was at a time, the late 80s, that questions about referring to God came to the fore. Uh, Knowing that language creates a value system and language creates its own metaphysics, the exclusive male language about God um, creates and upholds, justifies a system where men are in, the top ranks and women are sublimated, right? It also, male language about God also limits the experience of people who are hearing about God. There are those who, when thinking of a father, God as father, that's a trigger, right? I mean, I grew up with people whose fathers were terribly abusive, right? And when I think about God as father, I don't want to have that image of an abusive father because it's everywhere, right? At least back in the day, uh, it's a little different now, but back in the day, fathers were terribly emotionally and physically abusive. But that was the language we were expected to use of God. Uh, So if that metaphor doesn't work, then there have to be new metaphors. Can we draw on metaphors from our past that can, speak to this trigger that people have when speaking about God as Father? So the metaphors of God as mother, or God as lover, or God as friend are introduced, and trying to open up our understanding of God that has become stultified, you might say, with the traditional metaphors. This is what prophets need to do as well. Offer new metaphors, new ways of seeing the traditional experience of God. Um, a good example of this in among the other prophets, one that we didn't work with in our Sunday school class, our adult forum, uh, uh, it is the prophet Hosea. I was pausing there because I think I mentioned Hosea in the adult ed forum. But if you read that text, Hosea was an 8th century prophet, spoke to the northern kingdom of Israel, and he was called by God to do something extraordinary, incomprehensible, because Hosea comes from his prophetic caste, and he is asked to marry a prostitute and to have children by the prostitute and to give them names like "you are not my child." In other words, the assumption being that the prostitute is having bastard children, children who are not, Hosea's. And the anguish, the pain that goes into marrying a woman who is out chasing other men, right? Well, we know that that's a perfect metaphor for idolatry, right? That where Israel is seen as a woman who has been courted by God in the desert, that, Israel was a people who had nothing. God took them into his arms, and yet they turned their back on God and started chasing other men's, quote unquote, so to speak. Uh, so you get a really strong sense of the anguish that God goes through because you're offering this very human experience, this betrayal that, we probably have all felt on some level. Um, but it's so much more dynamic than just saying God is upset because you're worshiping idols, right? Uh, the prophet is the one who is able to introduce that metaphor and give people a very existential sense of how God is feeling, to empathize with the situation. And this is what Brueggemann is calling us to do as people living in the 20th or 21st century who are called to, speak out against the status quo, the royal consciousness. Let me stop there and see if there are comments that need to be made.
Do you
Yeah,
see
go
me?
ahead, Will.
Oh, can I make a comment?
Yes, please.
Hey, excellent discussion of metaphor. And I just finished reading the November Christian Century and found an article by Norman Wurzba about yeah,
I know
about a,
Norm. He's a Duke.
oh, okay. And the book he's getting his ideas from is his book. Um, it's by Robert McFarlane. Is a river alive?
Yeah,
And,
yeah,
all of us here are aware of rivers, and the metaphor, I think, kind of helps me understand what Brueggemann is talking about because a river has source springs
yep,
constantly taking in, but also bringing life, spreading out. So it's constantly moving and changing and can't be uh, monarchically controlled
yeah,
or channeled.
right.
It kind of makes its own way and brings life where
Excellent.
it goes.
And expand on that as well, because what happens when a river does get
Yes.
dammed up, right? And
Yeah.
water becomes literally dead. I mean, this is where we get the idea of living water in the Bible. Water that's moving. Everyone knows you should not drink water out of a standing pond, right? Nobody wants to drink that water because it is, well, it's a place where parasites and everything else can breed, but living water that's running is, you know, something that can give life, right? And so think about what the monarchical kingdom does, the royal consciousness does with God. God is a God of freedom. God is that flowing river, the river that runs through it. It's in one of my
Yeah.
favorite books. But what the royal consciousness does is take that river and dams it up, and so it can be used for its own purposes, right? There's a great metaphor right there, Will. Thank you so much.
Well, you almost summarized the article.
Well, I know Norm personally, and I know exactly what, because he and I are in the same kind
Oh,
of
well, I'm
uh,
glad I brought it up.
yeah, ecological theology. We went to grad school together, and he got lucky or unlucky, depending on how you look at it, and was given a position at Duke,
Uh,
Duke Divinity School, uh, on
and he
the
says,
on the recommendation of Wendell Berry, by the way. So
oh, that's another great one. And he
yeah.
says, rivers run through people as surely as they run through places.
So is does he make a reference to Norman McLean? The
No,
river runs.
I don't think so, but it's to me, Norman McLean is all over
Yeah,
this article.
yeah, right,
The
right.
river runs through it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that
Thank you.
gosh, that's a great book.
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
someday we should just read the concluding paragraph, the concluding chapter of that book about, the words flow beneath the river and the sense that, that God's order is an incomprehensible order, but can be brought to light in the living being that the river is. Oh, boy. Any other thoughts about metaphor? This is reminding me of my grad school days because this was such a big deal back in the late 80s. Um, okay, well, um, Brueggemann has this comment, and I want to take a minute I can't remember what my next slide is. Oh, there we go. That the royal consciousness really kind of creates a numbness, and it's a numbness about death. And here is another place where there's been a book in my life that was so transformational. When I was a senior in college and I read it. It was called The Denial of Death by a man by the name of no, excuse me, Ernest Becker. I almost said Walter Brueggemann. But basically, Becker was a cultural anthropologist. Becker's whole thesis is that our culture itself is nothing but an elaborate system to allow us to deny the inevitable, which is death, right? Death is always before us. And many of the neuroses that plague human beings stem from this denial that they are going to die, and all of those reminders in daily life. Uh, you know the scabs that form, for example, after you cut yourself. Well, why do people pick at those things, right? I don't want to see that. um, anyway, Becker just has example after example of how death is denied, and how that affects the experience of living as a full human being. Human beings live most fully and with the most integrity when they live in the presence of death. Not in such a way that death becomes overwhelming, but when they accept this as part of, their reality, their basic reality of what it means to be a human being. Um, Native Americans, the Lakota specifically, would often say it's a good day to die. And the reference to that would usually be, it's a good day for me to stand up and fight for my culture against, an invading culture. But more generally, to say that it's a good day to die is to recognize that what I have right now is a good experience of the world around me, but it's a fleeting experience. Death, entropy is what happens in life. And so what the prophet does, and this shouldn't be seen as macabre, uh, what the prophet does is remind people, hey, you know what you're denying here? You know what you're doing is you're trying to create blinders that keep you from one of the realities that is essential to understand if you're going to be human. So, as Brueggemann says, the task of prophetic ministry and imagination is to bring people to engage their experience of suffering to death. Um, and I know this, seems kind of strange, but think about the way that, as Brueggemann says, the royal consciousness kind of numbs people. He gives this great comparison of David, who had so much joy, and experience it, and so much sorrow at the same time. But what if you compare that to Solomon? Solomon tries to manage reality to the point of numbness, and this is where that passage from Ecclesiastes it becomes so relevant. Vanity, vanity, all is vanity. The rivers flow to the sea, and they're never filled up. There's a kind of a complacency, and I don't mean it, complacency like I'm happy in this situation, that sets in. And we get the feeling that this is going to be forever, that this is how things should be, stasis, absolutism, right? That's the language of the royal consciousness. Uh, this is something that is going to last forever. Think of Hitler's the Thousand-Year Reich. That just is essential to maintaining the control over that consciousness, to put aside all denials about ending. Failure is not a possibility. Now, I can't help but think of our current president at this point, right? And the kind of madness that is starting to take hold because there are cracks in this, this wonderful reality that he's established for himself, that, we're going to have this Republican epoch in which everybody is going to vote Republican and the flag is going to be once again respected, and white people will, the whole Project 2025. That is a forever type of management, a forever type of aspiration, but it's starting to fall apart. It fell apart in Miami last night, didn't it? You know what I'm talking about? The Miami, which is a stronghold of Latino republicanism, voted in, and that voted for Trump overwhelmingly in the earlier election, voted in a Democratic mayor.
And Dan, a woman,
And a
by
woman.
20, and by 20 points.
But
It was, it was not even sort of close.
yeah, it was a rout, basically. And, we're already seeing evidences of this as well in New Jersey with the governor, as well as I think there was a new senator, but there were two women who just recently were, I think in early November, were voted in over against Republican nominees who supported Trump. So imagine being Solomon, or imagine being any president, having this vision of how the world is going to be static and happy if it just maintains, the status quo that is put in place. And you start to see it crack, right? Start to see cracks that form in it. That's what I start thinking about whenever I'm reading Brueggemann in this area. It's just like this insistence that things always remain the same. And this is what was so helpful for me when I went to graduate school and was introduced to a philosophy called process philosophy, which, by the way, Mac, your son Paul was an advocate of when he was at Hastings College. He and I spoke about process philosophy all the time. A guy by the name of Alfred North Whitehead, from a science background, really tried to establish a philosophy that could incorporate God, but a God who was not going to try to establish some sort of static realm, right? Where the law was going to be the same and it's always going to be followed. But if you look at reality itself, reality is always changing. It's like the river, Will, right? It's like the river that's always changing. It's always changing its course. There may be pockets of stagnation at times, but it is ever flowing to the stream, and it's ever going through that whole water cycle. The same is true with with our reality. And Whitehead was able to show that despite all that change, God can still be present in that ongoing process. Unlike what we often see in fundamentalist religions, where God is an absolute unchanging being, here today as tomorrow and forever and ever, amen, right? But God is actually in conversation with the creation itself. Creation is continuing. And the things that are damming it up, like the royal consciousness, need to be picked away at by the prophetic imagination. Think about Jeremiah, this idea of the temple sermon. Let me just read it for you because I think I get a little bit confused because I've just recently talked about this in the Adult Ed Forum. So if I've read this before, I apologize, but this is Jeremiah who's speaking to the people of Jerusalem in the early, or I should say, the late 7th century. Babylonians are on the rise. They have a king by the name of Josiah, and they're pretty sure that God is favoring them. There's a kind of a nationalism, we might call it, that is arising in Jerusalem at this time. And so in Jeremiah chapter 7, Jeremiah the prophet comes and to the people who are, standing before the temple and looking at what a great structure it is and what it represents, he says this, the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord, stand in the gate of the Lord's house and proclaim there this word and say, hear the word of the Lord, all you people of Judah, you that enter these gates to worship the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, amend your ways and your doings, and let me dwell with you in this place. Do not trust in these deceptive words. This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. People of Jerusalem were resting assured that God was on their side, basically. Nothing's going to happen to us. Look at this. This is the temple of the Lord. How do you break that? How do you take that stagnant water, Will, and undam it? Well, the thing that's standing in the way of it, according to Brueggemann and Walter and Ernest Becker, is this denial of death. And death is this ever-present reality and needs to energize people to understand that, not all things last, but in the midst of the process, there are certain ways to be living in the world. And those were all established with the covenant back in Egypt. So there's a symbol gap. The royal consciousness tries to make sure that all symbols related to death are either eradicated or they are made to be repugnant. Think about the symbols that we see of death, the color black and the devil's skull and all of these things. They do not necessarily have to be seen as the enemy, but they're often employed for that very reason, right? This is everything you should fight against. But God is in death just as much as God is in life. So at this point, though, I want to make sure that we understand what a symbol is. And this, I'm going to draw on Paul Tillich. And I think we've talked about this in this class before. But Tillich has a short essay in a book called Theology of Culture, in which he makes a distinction between a sign and a symbol. He says a sign is an arbitrary thing that is assigned, if you pardon the pun, assigned a meaning. For example, a stop sign. We have, you can go all around the world and you'll see an octagonal red sign that, means stop when you're on the highway. But we could just as easily have made the sign green. It's almost, and said, this is what we mean when we see this green triangle sign, it means to stop, right? And if we were to change this, I mean, there would be some, if we were to change the stop sign and make it into something else, there'd be some grumbling about it, right? And it would take a while, but nobody would give their life to save a stop sign. That's the kind of the two-dimensional nature of a sign. They're arbitrary. A sign points to something else without participating in its reality, right? We create the reality of what that thing means. It has a limited conventional meaning and can be created or fabricated to serve certain ends. I think this is interesting because, when we look at stock market reports, if we see that there's a green color associated with the stock market or wherever your stocks are, that means good. If it's red, that means now you're losing money, right? If you go to China, it's completely flipped. If it's green, you're losing money. If it's red, that means, it's arbitrary, completely arbitrary. It points to something beyond itself. A simple, no, let me stop. Any comments about that? I love Tillich. A symbol is utterly different. A symbol, as in Tillich's word, a symbol participates in the reality it represents. It has a deeper, richer, more profound meaning that can evoke strong emotions. Symbols cannot be created. This is important. They cannot be created. They emerge from the collective experience or consciousness of a group. So the symbol of the covenant at Mount Sinai, the symbol of the burning bush, for example, that just wasn't made up. This is something that welled up from the history and the generational consciousness of a people. There's something about that experience at Mount Sinai that gives me a sense of identity. For another example, probably the one that we best know is the symbol of the flag. If you ever go to a Veterans Day parade and you see some of those old timers, kind of squeezed into their old Army uniforms, when that flag passes by, they're saluting, there's a tear coming out of their eye. That's what a symbol does. You try to change that symbol, and it is, you are going to destroy a part of somebody's identity. So symbols participate and represent, symbolize a reality that's much greater than themselves. And as such, we participate in that reality as well. Why do people get so upset when, about burning the flag? It's because you're burning part of your identity. You're burning something that, is essential to who you are as a person. So what prophets need to do, says Brueggemann, you just can't create new stories out of thin air. But over against the royal consciousness, you need to choose symbols that are going to shake people's reality to such an extent it reminds them who they are. They break out of their numbness that has been caused by the royal consciousness. But I'm going to stop there, see if there are any questions.
Dan, that reminds me of the contemporary concept of the meme, M-E-M-E.
Yeah.
What do you think Brueggemann would do with that?
Tell me what you mean by that. Can you expand on that? Because
Well,
I don't
people
really.
often talk about creating a meme from something they think a group will understand, and then others will say you've appropriated that meme and you've created a new understanding. So that, in my mind, there's just a lot of confusion about whether anyone would ever want to use it outside of a very specific context,
Right.
unless they want to be totally misunderstood. There's a lot of political rhetoric going on now where people pass along other people's quotes or memes, if you will, and then later on kind of categorically deny that they ever felt that way. Really, that was someone else's message. I mean, we're getting into an era now of, I think it's intentional confusion, but for other people, it's creating their own little world and then expecting other people to understand it. But it's very symbolic, I think.
Yeah, and I have to admit that I really don't understand. I can't give you an example of a meme. It's just not the world that I live in. I unless I do, and I just don't understand that I'm seeing a meme. But my guess is, from what you're saying, is that when these memes are being created, sometimes they incorporate not just signs but symbols, and in so doing, appeal to some part of the human uh, identity, an individual's identity as well as collective identity, that can either draw them in or repel them in one way or another. And if these things are created enough over time, you can create a reality that it has a mix of symbols to it that lends meaning to that little world that you're talking about. Because this is where we get our world of meaning is through symbols. This is why modern art, just think of Jackson Pollock. Very interesting. Jackson Pollock was a student of Thomas Hart Benton. Think about Thomas Hart Benton and the role that he played during the works progress during the Depression, painting murals and painting these symbolic images that lent themselves to manifest destiny and the individuality as well as the community of what it meant to be American, right? Benton took symbols in a prophetic way and was able to present them so that it drew people in. Now, Pollock, interestingly enough, he completely undermined that, right? And he just started creating art that didn't mean anything, right? It was art for art's sake. And that really challenged a lot of people. It's like art up until that time, up until the modern period, the abstract, expressionism had always incorporated some sort of symbolism. Always had some sort of symbolism. Now, I should never say the word always, but there was always symbolism involved with it. But the challenge to that was to just completely undermine it. Yeah. And so, and this is the beginning of what we call postmodernism, where there's no meaning behind anything, right? But we all know from what we see with these memes that are created that these symbols still run deep in our culture. What a prophet does is that when those symbols have become kind of tarnished over, almost to the point that they're unrecognized, they can polish off the tarnish and present them again to the people so that they're seen in a new way. And this is what Jeremiah is able to do. But he doesn't do it in a way where it's just like, hey, everything's going to be great. No, he has to have people go through fire in order to recognize the importance of these symbols. There's got to be grief that's associated with it. And grief always comes with being confronted by death. I mean, grief and death go hand in hand. I love this. I love what Brueggemann says about, how our culture, as well as Solomon's culture, tried to pander in this lewd promise of immortality. Lewd promise of immortality. Everything's going to be fine. Things are not going to change. Our king will live forever. Long live the king. That's forever thinking. And I think about our culture and the way that we try to gloss over, the nearness of death. Think about the U.S. cult of youth. I feel, I mean, maybe you all can relate to this, and maybe I'm just feeling it because of my own insecurities or something. But the grayer my beard became, the more invisible and irrelevant I became in the world. I want to see your faces and see if you feel that way. The grayer my beard became, the more irrelevant and invisible I became in our culture. It used to be I could go into a restaurant or sit at the bar and boy, people would pop right over and, what can I get you? It's like, but what's informing that? There's something that's informing that. It's the cult of youth. We don't see people with gray beards and gray hair selling laundry detergent. They're always these 20-year-olds acting like, 30-year-olds. And this is the model that's put in front of us. That is the glossing over that Brueggemann is talking about. That's the royal consciousness trying to keep people away from the grief, the suffering unto death. It's there. Why is it so tragic when a young person loses their life? It's because they represent to us immortality, right? It's not so bad when, 80, or well, they lived a good life, but somebody who's 20 years old and, maybe through some fault of their own, maybe through being, irrational or whatever, they die. And it's just, we're confronted with the fact that this symbol of immortality, and it is a symbol because they're drawing on symbols of a lot of the Greek gods in, our advertisements that we see. These symbols are uh, completely undermined by the death of a young person. So I just want to leave you with this. I'm sorry I'm talking so much, but this idea of immortality for me really, it does lie at the heart of, if you're a Christian, you want your soul to be forever and you want to live in heaven in this kind of unchanging, absolute reality in which your identity never, passes away. But as I did study Whitehead, he helped me to see that there's a different way of looking at immortality. He calls it objective immortality. And it's a very simple, he explains it in a complex way, but it's a very simple idea. Um, I will become immortal in the students that I have taught, in the people that I have met on the street. There's always going, even if it's just a singular passing, I never see this person again, right? There's something about my interaction with that person that becomes objectively immortal within them. Let's think about students. If we teach students and the change that takes place in them, that affects somebody else on down the line, so that a decision that I make or an experience that I provide to somebody will live forever as human beings pass that experience along. I am the repository of experiences of thousands and thousands of people that have come before me, millions of people, right? There's some objective immortality of a person I never knew in the 16th century that's living inside of me, just because the way that person affected a next person, and then in the next generation, then the next generation, next generation. My identity is never recognized as, some sort of absolute God who lives forever, right? That very few people ever experience that. But there's something of what I do that is going to live on. So it makes it all the more incumbent upon us to create that positive, that positive effect, so that it can be passed on, it can be paid forward, so to speak. And I think this is where the prophets would come down as well. Of course, when Jeremiah was speaking, there was no conception of heaven or hell. That comes much later, right? But the idea that you must represent the alternative consciousness of Moses that has brought you to this point and still lies dormant within you, if we can just provide the right symbols to draw that dormancy into a kind of dynamism that helps you to live according to that covenant. So I hope that wasn't too crazy. But Denny or anybody else will want to make a comment? It's not the pearly gates. It's not the harps. It's not the wings, the white robes sitting in the clouds, living forever and ever and ever and ever and ever, you know, ad nauseum. It's the recognition that you are making a difference here and will affect, whether for good or ill, people long into the future. There's a type of immortality that comes with that. So, anyway,
That's
well,
why
go ahead,
most
Will.
of us here, that's why most of us here are clergy or teachers.
Yes, yes, yeah, yeah. We recognize the importance of that, I think. Um, so there's a prophetic dimension to that we can continue to talk about. So when we return, I think we're at about page 44 44, 45, somewhere in our text. Yeah, right at the top of page 45. But we're not going to meet for 2 weeks. And I apologize for that, but I really do think because of the way that Mary Beatty is objectively immortal in me, because she's created such good karma, if you will, that I retain. I really want to honor her by being at this potluck. So, and then I guess I'll be in contact with you via email as the time approaches. But we will continue to read chapter 3 and then move on from there. So thank you, everyone. It's always the highlight of my week. Let me stop the share. All right. See you later.
Thank you, Dan. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Bye.
Bye.